So the next and last session of today is going to be on compositional control, intelligence without a brain by Deepak. This work is really fun and exciting and interesting to us. So as I mentioned earlier in my talk today, it's also somehow related to the results that we showed. And I think yeah, we'll see exactly what it's about, but essentially the fact that Deepak was able to get homogeneous policies to somehow work together to generalize to unseen topologies, unseen structures is really fun and exciting. So thank you very much for being here, Deepak, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think when we met last time about before COVID and all this craziness, the results I had back then, I think at this point are slightly outdated. So today's talk will talk about more recent extensions of that idea and slightly better results than before and in more realistic-ish settings. All right, so let me share my screen. Oh, is it already shared? Actually, do you see my slides in the presentation view or?
Yes, yes, we can see it well. Yeah. And I just want to mention that yes, we are excited about the new work. So we hope to hear something about the new one.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so let me start from here. All right. So, hi, I'm Deepak. I'm starting as a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in about 15 to 20 days. And I am currently a researcher at Facebook AI Research, and I'll be moving to Pittsburgh this month. And in today's talk, I thought I'll talk about this modularity work and give an introduction, which is kind of slightly out there and very different from the research I have been doing in the mainstream fashion. So this covers only a couple of my papers, and while most of my research is dominated by computer vision, robotics, and machine learning, and I'll not talk about that today. So if you're interested in other things, just go to my webpage on related to exploration, self-supervised learning, etc., and optimization, etc. Okay, so today's talk is about intelligence without brain. Okay, so we have been. So as I said earlier, I work in vision and machine learning, and I'm driven by this goal of building intelligent machines. Now, for most of my research, I've been focusing on at least embodied agent, as in agents which have body and are just not a piece of software. And so the question is like, how do we currently, how can we go about making these robots intelligent in one way or the other? And so that they can do multiple tasks without being tuned to one specific thing. In reality, like this is an example of a robot, like a robotic arm, Baxter robot over here. So let me begin by asking a question. Like, how do people go about training robots today? What's the common approach? And if I take a very 10,000 feet level, like really, really high level, the most common approach and the most successful one to train these robots is basically train these robots like an adult. What do I mean by that? Well, we want our robots to do things which human adults can do, like multiple tasks. So we provide them expert demonstrations, like demonstrations of tasks which humans already can do, so that robots can just mimic them. And these demonstrations contain state, action pairs, etc., etc. We provide them reward, and in fact, dense reward for one particular task, and labels like giving supervision. But the catch with this line of approach is that with this one, we can get our agents to function really well in one setup or for one task for which they are trained for. But it's really hard to generalize beyond the task you are trained for. I'll not show examples today, but this is kind of like lots of deep learning talk these days are about how deep learning cannot generalize. So I assume that you guys will just buy this. And it's very hard to generalize beyond what they are trained for. But on the other hand, even though we take inspiration from human adults, but humans can do lots of things at once. So how can we go about it? Well, the second camp in some ways, as argued by also Alan Turing, 60 years ago is to not directly go for the end task or the end reward, but rather train these robots like a human baby. And what does it mean? Like basically don't supervise for any goal to begin with, have the robot its own intrinsic goal or no external reward at all, and have them figure out tasks on their own by something known as curiosity or different formulations of curiosity, information gain, and things like that. But the fundamental idea is to explore in a self-supervised manner such that the robot is not specific to any task. It's basically task agnostic, and it can achieve several tasks later once it has explored the environment on its own. And in fact, I spent most of my research during my PhD and also after PhD in kind of building these kind of approaches, which fall into this second cam on the left. And in fact, I have done a lot of work in this area, which you can call curiosity-driven exploration. And as you see over here, what we like all these results that you are seeing on the screen, all these results are these agents which are training to do several things, but they are completely unsupervised. So they are not shown any goal whatsoever from outside, and they just learn completely on their own via curiosity. And then as a side effect, they learn to play all these games on the left. They learn to control robotic arm to pick up the objects. And it's more or less same algorithm, which is used from Mario on the left to robot on the right. And the key idea over here is for the agent to get excited or interested about things which they cannot build a model of. So the violation of, so an agent goes in the world and continuously tries to build a model of how the world behaves, and it gets curious whenever its own mental model disagrees with what's happening in the environment. And we have done a lot of work in this area, and you can go to our webpage and look at this if you're interested. But this is one of the things that I'm really excited about. But today's talk is not about that, as I mentioned in the disclaimer in the beginning. And in today's talk, I'll take a very high picture, which is not tied to this timeline. Like in this timeline, the problem is as follows: this is of nature versus nurture. This is a very famous issue. Like even when you learn like a baby and you don't have any goal, it's very hard to resolve how much to build in and how much to learn. Like, do I build in convolution? Do I build in recurrence? Do I build in modularity? Do I build in objects? Do I build in object properties? Like, where does it stop? Like, at what point do I build certain things in, and at what point do I start learning from there? And this is a huge debate, for instance, in psychology and developmental cognitive science. And this issue stems from this basic problem that we don't know what humans are probably born with, right? And if you're a psychologist or a neuroscientist interested in human brain, it makes sense to be restricted to this timeline. But for instance, I am a computer scientist, and most of the hard work is not done by me. It's done by the computers. So I don't have to be restricted to this timeline of human baby to human adult. What we can do is take a look at a very high level picture. Like really fundamentally notice over here that even in case of babies, we start our software from scratch in some ways, at least in the curiosity-driven exploration work. But our robot is still this very complex hardware, which just starts with this 20 or so motors, and it has to learn to do all these tasks. So in this talk, I asked this basic question: can we take a look at a very high level picture? And instead of not like adults, but like babies, can we start even earlier? Like just look at a very high level picture and start much earlier in the pipeline. And so what is even earlier than this? Well, if you think about this, humans by themselves have evolved some way in this evolutionary process over the years. And whatever we call prior knowledge that humans are born with, that prior knowledge must have evolved some way during this timeline, because everything began from calcium, magnesium ions combining with electricity and water. Like the notion of object, animals, it must have evolved somewhere along the way. And in fact, most of these things which we are obsessed about, like intelligence and brain, even long before brains evolved, there were these things called cells, which inherently are intelligent by themselves. and especially this time period of when single cells combine to multi-cell. This is kind of like one of the big bangs of evolution, where things go from always competing to collaborating, and these cells, in a way, demonstrate some sort of distributed collective intelligence, which can be seen across several species in the nature. For instance, these fantastic examples given by Michael Levin in his NeurIPS keynote a couple of years ago of these flatworms. So for instance, in these flatworms, cells capture the blueprint of the whole body, including the brain. So for instance, you can cut these flatworms at tail, and you change the electrical properties of the cells at the tail via some catalyst. And then the cells start to think that they have to grow a head at this place. And at tail location, they start to grow a head by themselves. And now you see what they get is they have two head. The same worm has two head. So you cut a tail, the cells at the tail already had a blueprint of how the head would look like. And it could just grow it again, changing the electrical signals. And you can see more from Michael's talk from NeurIPS and his other work. And this kind of distributed intelligence is not just in flatforms. Like other class example is the slime mode, and where slime, there is no centralized brain as per se in these organisms, and it's completely distributed throughout the body of the agent. And these are all single organisms. But this is not the case just for single organisms. For instance, these ants over here, these Armenian ants show demonstrate very complex coordination by themselves. Like they can form bridges. This is video from Radhika Nagpal, who's a professor at Harvard. And so in biology, this collection of ants is considered a singular organism because they are so tied to each other and can do interesting things, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, so this is great. So these were some examples of where these agents don't have the notion of centralized coordination, but they can still coordinate really well only via these elemental atomic distributed pieces. So how can it help embodied robots? Like, why am I talking about all this? Well, one inspiration that we take from this process is this notion, like this process of where single cells become multi-cell kind of scenario, is that these things are going from competition to collaboration. And when they collaborate, they combine, they become a single organism. Like these two things combine, they become a new single organism. And let me see if I can bring the laser. Oh, okay. Okay, here. Oh. How do I bring the laser thing here? Anyway, never mind. Okay, so when they combine, they share the objective, and this compositionality is fundamental to all these biological organisms. And this in machine learning and in deep learning, we have exploited this compositionality at all the levels in language. Right? There are a lot of papers in language, even in vision, there are papers on compositionality, but they are exploiting compositionality of object, text, captions. So it is still purely about language so far, what we have been exploiting primarily in learning. But in language, the compositional structure is already known to us, because language is a byproduct of human civilization. So we as humans have made the language. So we know how it is composed, how things are composed, etc., etc. But what we are talking about today is not compositionality in language, but compositionality in hardware of the agent. And these agents, the compositionality has to be discovered along the body of the agent and along how does it control its own body and how does it do several tasks. So we have been interested in this problem of how do we implement this compositionality in hardware. So we began thinking about this problem at three and a half years ago. So we thought maybe let's start with a simple setup where we can really study all these things. But despite being simple, we wanted to stick to realistic simulations. So at least proper physical simulations. So what we start with is this environment. And this environment is really simple. What we are trying to emulate is some sort of distributed collection of agents that I just described earlier. And to emulate them in our machine learning systems, what we do is we make these very stupid and dumb robots. It is just a cylinder, a limb, and it has a motor attached to it. And this motor has 3 degrees of freedom. It can rotate in alpha, beta, gamma. It can apply 3 torque in 3 directions. And that's all it can do. So there is no other power for this agent. It can only rotate in 3 directions. Now note that these agents are all put together in the simulation. And this is a simulation we build in Unity. So it's a proper physics-based simulator to the approximation of Unity. Okay, but we make one change, and the change is as follows: that these agents are allowed to combine with each other, and when they combine via magnet. So they can apply torque onto itself, like in 3 directions, but these agents are allowed to combine with other agents. They can apply magnetic force to become single agent, and whenever they combine, they behave like a single agent, not multi-agent. So when they are different, they are multiple agents, but when they combine, it's a new single agent, and they share the reward function. Okay, so the input to these agents is just local sensory input. Like each agent only observes a local information about itself. Like each cell cannot really know the function of others, like very far away cell, or what it is sensing. Similarly, these agents cannot sense what other limbs are sensing. It is completely local, completely homogeneous. Now note that in the output, they can apply torque. So it's 3 degrees of freedom. And they have 2 additional actions. They can link or unlink. So they can decide to detach from the agent or attach itself to the other agent, okay, via magnet. So it's local. I'll just convey the key idea very upfront in the talk. The key idea over here is to share the controller throughout the body of the agent. Now, throughout this talk, in all the results, a single policy is shared across all motors of the agent. Okay, so each policy, the output of each policy is to apply, as I wrote here, the output of each policy is to apply torque, link, unlink, and the same policy is shared throughout the body of the agent. And in this talk, we'll see how do we go about building such an agent which has shared policy all across the board. And this policy is shared across not just one agent, but all the agents that we'll train on. And we'll go into the details a bit later in the talk. Okay, so let's see how well can we build this idea? How well can we make this idea work? So in this environment, what our goal is, the goal of this learning without a centralized coordinator and all decentralized modules is to generalize. And that was the initial motivation, right? We could train via curiosity, we could train via expert demonstration, but that's not the goal, because those things are still very hard to generalize beyond what they're trained for. And the goal of this work is to train in a way such that the agents is more flexible, more plastic to adapt to novel scenarios. So what we'll do in this setup is, as shown on the left, we will train on 2 tasks. So let's say task of standing up, task of locomotion. And once they are trained, we'll test these agents on a wide variety of new scenarios. And at test time, the testing is completely zero-shot. So the agent will not take any gradients or any information about the environment, and then they will just adapt in a plastic manner. So let's see one example over here. Let's consider task of standing up. And the goal here is to maximize the y-axis. Let us see how well does a vanilla reinforcement learning agent will work in this task. Now, if your agent only has a single limb, vanilla RL is good at solving this task to perfection very early on in the training. If you have 2 limbs, it's easy. Now note that this problem is of continuous control. So it is like balancing multiple towers on your hand, one over top of each other. And you have to apply torque at each location. So the problem becomes hard as you keep increasing the number of limbs, because your action space multiplies linearly. And so it's even though it's an easy problem for single or 2 limbs, but it becomes hard when you have number of limbs on the robot. Now, instead, what do we do? Well, as I described the setup earlier, we allow these agents to self-assemble from very primitive agents on their own, okay? So what happens over here is that we take these agents. Now, in the beginning of training, these are all different limbs. All they can do is rotate about their motor. They cannot really do much. But after training, what they learn is to learn to make this tower on their own. And they can combine. So this is happening via magnet. So, and towards the end of training, they learn to make a perfect tower. in the case when vanilla allele could not really stand up on the right. Now the results I'm showing, you can see it's like a curriculum learning, but happening over hardware, because the agent discovers its own curriculum over time. Now, does it generalize to new scenarios via this learning? So at test time, what do? Is we give it twice the number of limbs. So even though it was trained on only single limb, at test time, we give it twice the number of limbs. It can still stand up to a decent height. It doesn't make a perfect tower because the task is much harder now, but it makes a higher tower than before. And if you decrease the number of limbs, it makes a perfect tower, as shown below. You can also apply forces on the agent, and it can change shape to balance itself. And note that it's the same policy being applied at all the motors for all the agents, as we see here. So let's say one more task of locomotion. Now the task is to maximize x-axis, so move towards the right. And it makes this weird shape to move to the right. And note that the surface is bumpy over here, and it's making a small agent to move to the right. Now at test time, to generalize without any fine tuning, we add twice the number of limbs, as we see over here. Okay, it can still move to the right by making this weird creature that crawls to the right. But we can also change terrain. Like from that bumpy surface, we change it to these hurdles, and the same policy without any further fine tuning can still generalize to these new scenarios. We can also replace bumpy surface via hills, and it still generalizes. And one hypothesis why is it able to generalize is the fact that if you think about this, okay, let's see one more result over here with the gaps over here. Since the agents are completely modular, they can also leave one or two limbs in the gap and they still move forward. So one hypothesis is that since the agent is completely modular, so a small agent trying to climb a bump in a small bumpy surface is sort of similar via modularity to a bigger agent which is trying to climb a hill. And probably that's why it is able to still transfer skills to these very different environments. And with the gap scenario, these agents can lose limb because it's again fully modular. And when you lose a limb, it's totally fine. You can still control the remaining of the body. Okay, but all these robots in some ways were still, I would say, a bit abnormal because we don't have that many, except for slime molds and this flatworm, we don't have that many animals in the biological world which can change their shape in such a frequent manner. They cannot really detach. I cannot detach my hand from here and attach it over here, given the circumstances. So the question is, can we really apply these ideas to more normal practical robots to some extent? And is there any advantage to that? Well, yes. I would argue that in case of practical robots, generalization is even a bigger problem. For instance, you might have all seen all these practical robots from Boston Dynamics, which can do all these parlor tricks, can do really amazing things, but things that seem very trivial, apparently, the same agent fails to put a block on the desk over here and fails rather catastrophically over itself. And this is very common. I mean, this is not just these robots. Generalization is really hard. In fact, it's also very hard to generalize beyond a robot because every robot that we have is different. And in fact, in my 2 minutes of Google search, I could find all these robots different shape. And there is no way I can download a model from web. Like before I joined the call, there was discussion going on about GPT-3. Like you can download GPT-3 and fine tune it on several language tasks. Now I make a robot in my lab. There is no such way that I go to web, download a controller and it will work on the robot. It's really hard. In fact, it would take me months to build a controller for my own robot. And that might not transfer to anything even with one limb changed. Like this robot over here is NASA's dexterous manipulator, which they use in space and other missions. Like how do I make a controller for this robot? Nobody might even have this robot. And if I look at all these robot control and via reinforcement learning, like it's already very hard to train these policies for just one robot, like for shown on the left. And if we just remove one limb from this robot, like remove 1 feet, the same policy completely crashes to generalize to this new setting. So how do we go about solving this generalization problem in normal robots? And can the idea of modularity be useful as it was useful in the case of self-assembling agent, which could detach their limbs and adapt to combine to become better over time? Now, okay, so it doesn't generalize over here. And what about training on multiple robots? Maybe it is not generalizing because I'm training only on one robot, but there are people who have attempted this problem before in some ways, where they pre-train a controller for a wide variety of robots. But as you see on the screen over here, the diversity in the training set is not as much. Like for instance, on the left, this is training on multiple robotic arms with different number of limbs, but it's not very diverse. On the right, this is NerveNet. They train on this caterpillar agent, so they still train on same topology. They train on 2 legs, 4 legs, 6 legs, and they test on 8 legs, for instance. They do have some results on on Walker as well as cheetah type of agent, but for those results, it still requires heterogeneous policies, which are different from torso for legs, etc., etc. So our goal in this work is to really go towards and try to attempt this problem of generalization in robotics. Like the dream over here is such that you build a robot in your lab, and you should be able to go to web and download a model, and then that should work on your robot to some extent, even without training, like some sort of ImageNet pre-training kind of goal, but for robotics. And that's a very high level and 10 years goal, maybe earlier if we are successful faster. But this is towards the direction. And in this work, what you want to do is to train a same policy across very different robots. Like on the left, it's a walker, on the right, it's a humanoid, and you want to share the same policies over there. And it's really hard. Like, what does it mean to share the policy between these two agents? Like the humanoid walks and walker walks in a very different manner. Like, what does it mean to share the policies? And in this work, what we'll try to address or try to achieve is not just training a policy for one robot or two robots, but a large number of robots as shown over here. Like we train on more than 20 robots, and we generalize to more than like a lot of those. So it's like in total like 50 or so robotic shapes that we could try in these environments. So our goal is to build a single policy. And the whole reason we are doing that is not to train at training time, but to generalize at test time, so that we can zero-shot generalize to new agents. Like it might not excel at unseen agents, but it should still be a very decent initialization to control those robots. So it's a very challenging task. So unlike like in case of vision or language, where you could train on the task of image classification or word prediction, it's very challenging in this case because every robot has different number of inputs, limbs or output actions. So how do I even share a policy across these robots? But the harder problem is that for these normal robots, is that every robot has to follow a different gait to walk. So they need a different behavior. So unlike the results I showed before, over there, I was not trying to make every robot walk, because the robots I showed, they could change their shape to walk. Like if the current shape doesn't walk, they'll just change the limb and then try to walk. In case of herders, they become like a snake and walk forward, right? But these normal robots cannot really change shape arbitrarily. They have fixed shape. And like a one-legged humanoid has to hop. Like we cannot walk with one leg. And two-legged humanoid has to walk. So the problem over here is slightly harder in that sense. Like each policy not only has to excel across all the robots, but it has to represent different behaviors conditioned on the overall body structure. So the question is, okay, if it's a hard problem, why should it be even possible? Like, is there any evidence from biology that that suggests that this happens in nature to some extent? And in fact, there is this. So this is fantastic slide from Robert Full, who is a professor at Berkeley. This is from like 2000s or something, like several years back. And what he argues over here is that very different looking species like these cockroach, humans, dogs, and crabs, even though they have very different physical structure, the force pattern that they apply while walking on the ground actually is shared across different species, and it's very similar to one another. And in fact, we also have this, we also have these precocial animals in nature. So for instance, these horses on the right and giraffe on the left. And these animals can just start to walk as soon as roughly they are born. Like giraffes and horses, they start to walk and stand up 1 or 2 hours after birth. And on the right, there is a video after 4 days and starts to run properly. And it's not just these two, like there are multiple super precocial animals. And the argument over here is that it's the time after birth is so less that they didn't really have time to fine tune their controller. So they are sort of born with this a pre-trained controller, so as to say, to walk immediately after birth. And this is not the case in humans, for instance, and humans learn it by practice over time. So before I go to the results or the method of how do we do it, this is a teaser of the result, and it's a single policy that is shared across all these agents, and it is showing different behaviors. Now let me show you how do we achieve this. Like, so how do we train a single policy to control all these agents together? Well, the idea is again very similar. As I described earlier, the key idea for this talk today is modularity, but modularity at the level of hardware as well as software. So we'll again share the same policies across all the motors of the agent as I showed earlier, okay? Now, in the previous case, there was a single agent, but the agent could change its shape. But in this work, now we have multiple agents. And what we do is for each of these agents, we train a single policy that is shared across all the motors, okay? This is a shared policy across all the motors, not of only one agent, but the motors of all the agents, okay? So it's a single policy across all the motors of all the agents. Now, I skipped all the details earlier, so let me go into the detail. Now, if I just share the policy directly, will it work? Like I take this agent, and I share the policy everywhere. Well, it does not work. So what I've been telling you so far was hiding more details over here. Just sharing the policy is not enough. And you can yourself think, why is it not enough? But it's kind of obvious, because if my hand, as well as my torso, as well as my hands, my legs, my foot, if they all have the same policy, how do they know how to act? Because my legs muscles need to act differently. My hands need to act differently. My torso needs to act differently for this agent to work. So this doesn't work because there is no global coordination over here. So what do we really want over here? We want some sort of global coordination to happen. And we also simultaneously want to share the policy at all the locations. So the same policy is shared at the torso, and the same policy is used as the head of the agent, or leg, or foot. So what is really happening here? What do we want is, we want our networks to kind of behave like Lego block. I should be able to apply the same network on top of each other as well as at the bottom, right? Now the problem is, our usual networks are not Lego blocks, because they have some input and they have some output, and the output has different shape than input. So I cannot really put a policy at the top of each other, because their connections are not compatible. So what do? Is just we add an extra vector to input and to output. And these vectors live in the same dimension space, okay? Now, these vectors, in a way, for me, will act like the hook of Lego block. So suppose there is an agent over here, and I have a policy over here. I'll just copy the policy 3 times, and I'll apply it at all the limbs. And in between the limbs, these messages will act like the communication channel. So the output communication of one policy becomes the input of other, even though both of them share the weight with each other. So the weights are completely shared, okay? All right, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt right now, or we can take questions at the end as well.
So I have a question. So that works if you if every motor is linked to only one other motor. Now you have some places where some motor are linked to 2 other and some to 1. So how do you deal with this situation?
Yeah, so you can do several things. For instance, over here, let's say you trained on this robot, and one motor is linked to one other. And let's say on the right, you have these ones. So what you do is you just copy this limb from here and you combine it over here. Now you have 2 motors linked to 1 motor over here. So how do you combine messages? Well, one very simple thing you can do is you can average the messages together. Like just take an average of both of them. You can also add them together, and you can also concatenate them. So you can say, okay, at most I will have k messages or k children. So let's say my max limit is 10 children. I can always put them in 10 slots. So you can do all sort of things to combine it. So it's not, so it's a practical issue in some ways, but you can go around it very easily without much assumptions. Okay. So it's very simple. You just cut and paste the same module, arbitrarily shape, depending on the agent at testing. Now the question is, how do you pass these messages? Well, since let's assume for now that there are no cycles, because cycles are very rare in the real world. So if there is no cycle, what you can do is you can just pass the messages one way. So you can either do bottom up, like from the leaf node to any node over here to the topmost torso, or from the top node to the right. But note that all these policies are completely shared. So there is no explicit notion of root node. So root node over here is just an imaginary concept, because you can see it's a tree. You can assume any node to be a root node, and you can just lift a tree from there, and the last limbs will become the leaf node. Okay? Now this is one way. So does it work? Well, it doesn't quite work, and you can see why. So it's an interesting failure in this case, why it doesn't work. So if you are passing these messages only one way, it's very hard to represent multiple behaviors. So what it does work across multiple agents, but it only shows one behavior. So for instance, in this case, it is showing a hopping behavior. Like as you see over here, this agent is hopping forward slightly, in a very shy and nervous manner. And on the right, if you see, this agent has actually 2 legs. I don't know if you can see, but this agent has 2 legs, and it is also hopping instead of walking. And if you train this network further during training, then these 2 agents start walking, like as you see here and as you see here. But now this one only has 1 leg. It cannot really walk. So it starts to completely fail and doesn't do anything. So what is happening over here? Well, one way is very hard to get the shape of the body, and it's very hard to detect. So if you're doing top down or bottom up, it's impossible to know whether the agent has 2 legs or 1 leg. Should I hop? Should I walk? And by the time you come down to realize you only have 2 legs, you have to already commit whether to walk or hop. So this is not enough. So what we do as a solution is very simple. We just do one more round. So we do both ways. So we start from bottom, we go to top, and then top to bottom. Now note that top and bottom are just imaginary concept over here. I can assume any node to be a root node. I can say this is my root node. If I say this is my root node, then these 2 will become the leaf node, and they can go from until here, from here to here, and then go back. Okay, but for simplicity for this diagram, let's imagine this is a root node, and any node can be a root node. Okay, so every policy is shared, and now that for simplicity, we can assume, or we represent this policy, which is a shared policy, by 2 modules. One module that goes bottom up, and then other one that goes top down. So this whole thing is my policy, which is shared everywhere. Okay. Now, how does it work? The bottom up module takes state of the current limb. It takes communication, which is coming from the children of that limb. It outputs a message to the parent node, because it's a tree. You can assume a tree structure. So this is a what do we call it? This is an ordering of the nodes, topological ordering of the nodes. So it goes to a parent. Now from parent, you receive the message and you take your own passed message. And while coming down, you output the actions and you pass the messages to the children. Okay. So again, in the bottom up pass, you go all the way up, and the information from all the states goes to the upper node, and then top down pass, while coming down, you output actions for each node. Okay, now this 2-way message passing should be enough to capture the information about the agent. And note, the same policy is shared everywhere, but still they will act differently because each policy has a different message vector. Okay? So now let us see some results over here. And as we show over here, the same policy, even though it is shared across all the agents and across all the limbs, it shows different behaviors across all these ones. Like this one is hopping, this one is walking. The difference is also there in all these walker agent, even though it's a single policy. This one is hopping, this one is walking. I mean, this is also hopping kind of, but this one is walking. This is doing something else. Like it's even stark over here. Like look at these three agents, for instance. Like such different gates across all these agents, even though the policy is shared everywhere. It's the same policy acting on the foot of the agent, torso, tail, back leg, everywhere. And the gates are very different depending on the shape. Now, the reason why we did this in the first place is to generalize to new agents at test time. And here I'm showing some generalization result. Now note that we kept these specific shapes held out at training time. So even though they might look similar, well, but still it does reasonable on these new agents without ever being trained on them. Now, but they are very similar looking, and this is held out, this is test time, but it is still from the same distribution. The question we ask now is, does it actually generalize beyond the same distribution, like really, really different agents? So we went crazy about testing this. So we thought, okay, how about we just design very weird looking agents as I'm showing here. Now note that this is some sort of instantiation of these new robots we made. We download the same policy as trained earlier, no fine tuning, and it does decent. Like it doesn't excel, it doesn't run very fast to the right, but it is still able to balance and do reasonable things. For instance, over here, it has this weird gait, which it discovers at test time. Like this one has very heavy arms, as you see. It cannot really lift its own weight, so it starts to walk on the knees from the same policy. Over here, it has multiple legs. We never gave that many legs at training time. It can still do decent, etc. We can also, okay, we went slightly more crazy in testing. So we added objects at test time. There was no notion of objects at test time or at training time, but even then at test time, it can still do this, reasonable things. It can still move slightly forward or not fall, even though you don't excel in moving and running forward. And of course, there is no training here. It's zero-shot testing with the same policy. So what if we just keep increasing the weight of the agent, for instance? So on the left, if we make it too heavy, it becomes hard because, of course, it's not enough muscle strength to make them walk. In this case, the whole body is very heavy, so it just cannot really bear to walk. In this one, we remove the legs altogether. So it tries to use the hands, but doesn't succeed and doesn't make any progress. So these are some failure examples, but are still very reasonable. So the last question is, so far I showed results where a single policy is able to demonstrate multiple behaviors. So it means that some sort of coordination must be emerging via messages, because otherwise there is no way a same policy can hop as well as walk or do different gaits. But so showing those results is in some sense a proof that this is emerging, but can we also visualize it? Because if you go and ask biologists or biomechanics people, they have all these patterns which they show of gaits which are shared across humans and other species. And these gaits, they're called biological central pattern generators. And this is also a term used in control, but I think it's more common in biology as well. So can we also analyze our messages which are emergent from these agents? So this is the last result. So what we test is the visualization of outgoing message from the root node. Now, any node can be a root node, but whichever node you pick to be a root node for the tree, we take its message and we visualize it across their episode. So on the x-axis is the variation across episode. On the y-axis, it is 1D projection. So we take t-SNE projection of the message. So message is 64 dimensional. We project to 1 dimension and we visualize it. How does it look? Well, in the beginning of training, the messages are totally random. So they revolve around 0. They don't have any signal. So this is during one episode of training, in the beginning of training. But as we train the robot, in the middle of training, the messages across the episode start to take some shape. Like if you see some shape is emerging over here. Towards the end of training, what we find that these very regular patterns emerge completely out of nowhere from 0. And when we find the correlation, we found that the peak of these messages or the peak of the projection of these messages corresponds to the shape of the robot at different locations in time. And in the case of a walker, it has 2 peaks. In case of hopper, it has 3 peaks, and these 3 peaks correspond to 3 different shapes of the agent. And this is completely happening out of nothing. So this is completely from scratch. Now the question is, okay, these modularity idea and inspiration from very big picture is still a bit crazy. Is it even possible to apply these ideas to the real world? And in fact, for the first work I described on modularity and self-assembling agents, there are already existing self-assembling robots in the real world. But the difference is that these robots are, these are demonstration of the hardware, and the software is controlled by someone manually in all these cases. And in fact, we also are trying to scale these ideas to real robotic agents beyond simulation. And one of such real robot is this a Daisy robot, which we have at Facebook, for instance. And this robot has the similar motor being shared at all the locations. It's not the exact same motor, but it's very similar. And we are trying some hierarchical control in these agent with modularity and other things. So it's not homogeneous right now. We are still to get to go there, but this is some very early result on these things. So it's modular in terms of hierarchy and not in terms of motors, but we hope soon it will be. And this is one of the robots which can try to work. Okay, to summarize my talk, there are 2 directions which I'm really excited about in building embodied intelligent machines. One of the directions is curiosity, which in a way is ontogeny, which basically means learning during the life of the agent. So the term is ontogeny. And the other is phylogeny, which is learning not during the life of that agent, but across its evolutionary lifetime. So we humans have both phylogeny and ontogeny. And the first one is curiosity, learning without goals, learning on your own. I didn't show it today, but if you're interested, go to my webpage for more results. And modularity, we showed results across different robots, which self-combine as well as normal robots. And hopefully we'll have more results in real robots at some time point. And I would say these are still very early directions, but the results are promising and still a long way to go. All the code and the paper and models are available on my webpage. Feel free to check them out. Thank you.